me try to see if I can control the slides. Or
I'm happy to.
okay, so if,
I'm happy to control from here.
so if you do the next slide, please.
Let me just find it. There's too many slides open, George. Right. What we see on screen and what I see in front of me is two different things.
Okay, so let's cue it up.
If,
Is it this one?
Want to correct them?
Go to this one. Yes. What you see and what you see is two different things.
that's what we see.
Yes.
Okay, so we could go without the slides. Okay.
Okay, you can change it from there.
Okay.
It's multiple of them.
Go to this
one. Okay.
Here we go.
Okay, great. Thank you. So that is where Aberdeen is located. I thought I should show you the
Yes. Now we can see the right in the north.
in the east of Scotland, and we are even. So if you go to the next slide, just to show the world map of where Aberdeen is located. So when I came here and everyone told me that it was going to be very cold in Cape Town, I was waiting. This feels like summer. So it's a pleasure to be here. Maybe the next slide. So I just thought to introduce the University of Aberdeen as well. So we are the fifth oldest English-speaking university in the world. We were founded in 1455. Sir Duncan Rice Library is reputed to be one of the most beautiful in the world. I'm saying Aberdeen. Our coastline was named as one of the 20 most iconic landscapes in the world by National Geographic. Aberdeen is ranked the 20th in the New York Times list of must-see global destinations. We have one of the lowest crime rates in Scotland, and we have more castles per acre in Aberdeenshire than anywhere else in the British Isles. So just in case you're interested in visiting Aberdeen, I hope that we have sold that. And I thought the next slide, we could just share where the university is at the moment. So in the University of Aberdeen, we have 4 strategic themes. That's the next slide, please. Inclusivity, interdisciplinarity, international, and sustainable. So the university has an international outlook. It is keen to establish international relations with other universities globally. So just having the invitation to come here to UCT to see what the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance is doing, I think fits neatly with one of the university's strategies. We have 5 interdisciplinary areas. We're working on energy transition, social inclusion and cultural diversity, environment and biodiversity, data and artificial intelligence, health, nutrition, and well-being. So while we're a university based in Scotland, we have an international outlook, and we're working on course-specific areas, and I think that we can have areas of interlinkages with global institutions. So this is an invitation for anyone interested in any of the areas that we're working on to please feel free to reach out, in the future as we establish this relationship with UCT and the Nelson Mandela School. As Ambassador mentioned, I work on international economic law and specifically intellectual property, technology, food, agriculture, and now I'm realizing that I'm working on gender as well. So I was invited by one of the UN offices to talk about closing the gender gap in science, technology, and innovation on the United Nations Day of promoting or celebrating the status of women. And I'll just give you a brief story of how I got into intellectual property, since this is an informal session for us to get to know one another. So when I was younger, I wanted to do food technology, food science and technology. And my mom thought because I really liked eating a lot, that was the reason why I wanted to study food science and technology. So he said, think of something else. So I thought, okay, law. My dad was a lawyer, so I thought, okay, I could do law. And then fast forward, when I went for my master's at the University of Warwick, I did the master's in international economic law, and one of my modules was on intellectual property law. And in one of the classes, we had a conversation about intellectual property rights and seeds. And I haven't made that connection before that. So my supervisor, my lecturer who later became my supervisor, Dr. Dujan Mangleka, he talked about a seed having an outer component, that's the hardware, and the software, the plant genetic materials. And I'd never made that connection or linkage. And I said, okay, if I'm going to do a PhD, then I'm going to do it in this. So when I told him I was applying for a PhD in plant variety protection, he said, oh, that's a very fascinating topic. Where would you like to study? And in my mind, I'm like, of course I want to study with you. You're the reason why I'm doing this. Anyway, so I ended up doing my PhD in plant varieties, so intellectual property rights for plant varieties. Unfortunately, he passed away in my second year, but I think that his purpose was really just to introduce me to the subject, and I feel that I'm, working and carrying on his legacy in that field. So after completing my PhD in intellectual property rights for plant varieties, I realized that there was a broader conversation to be had around the global governance of intellectual property. And many times when I'm reading intellectual property, while I don't live in Nigeria any longer, so I'm originally from Nigeria, my research, my heart is on the continent. So I'm usually thinking about where Africa fits in the conversation on intellectual property. And that has carried on into the different areas of research and public advocacy that I've been involved with. So I ended up, engaging in further conversations around food generally. So food systems, how do we promote food systems that are resilient and sustainable and that would ensure that African countries, for example, would have access and the right to food. So that was how I got involved in the conversation with the United Nations Special Rapporteur on right to food. And it has also carried on my conversations around technologies, new technologies, and now broader issues around international economic law, sovereign debt. So I'm seeing that many of the topical contemporary issues that we're having conversations are interlinked, right? So there's a connection between sovereign debt and poverty and food production and the right to food and gender, right? So I'm seeing all of those interconnections. And I think that this has enriched my outlook in my research. So my central claims here in this conversation is around the African Union's Agenda 2063. I say that it is a bold, revolutionary framework with the potential to disrupt and dismantle the status quo in Africa by enhancing economic integration, accelerating intra-African trade, and promoting sustainable economic growth and development. Africa possesses the necessary human and natural resources to successfully achieve this Pan-African Renaissance envisioned in the Agenda 2063. However, it requires concerted efforts and strategic actions across multiple terrains to realize the potential. So that is my starting point for now. And I thought that I could perhaps just play this short trailer of the man or the boy who harnessed the wind. So it's a story from Malawi that many of us, will be familiar with. And this story, I think for me, depicts one of the essence of Africa. So the resilience, the creativity, the innovation, the individual, the intrinsic motivation, despite odds. So we could play this and then continue the conversation.
Secondary school. Because no, it's up, man.
Can't you call is not the wealthiest school in the district, but it's down to each one of you to decide your own level of commitment.
The rains came late this year, and now the trees are gone. It's depending on analysis. It's a good development.
What are you going to do? Anything new? It's a bomb. Can you fix it? Maybe.
So that's what we tell the world of why the light shines. It's seamless. Into water. Put it.
This house. Still, we die.
No. Electricity. We can plant in the dry season.
And go for good see what's in there.
I'm very grateful. Because you took attack. Not to the little place. It was a quilt.
So we see a young man here saying against the odds with limited education, growing up in an atmosphere, a family of poverty, innovating something original to help not just his family and community, but the whole country. Now, this story has proliferated because of the power of the creative industries. Within the conversation around the creative industries, we see the role of copyright fundamentally at the center of publishing of movies, right? So the stories that are being told, the rights in the production, so the multiple layers of rights that will be involved in the production. We have both copyrights and related rights there. So not just creating an innovative product despite limited education, but also circulating that story. We see Chiwetel Ejiofor, who is of Nigerian origin but has been successful in Hollywood, this is his debut movie, directing that movie and telling that story. If he didn't tell us the story, then I perhaps might not have fully understood the history or the background to this, I think, laudable achievement. So we see the role of intellectual property, because first of all, you need resources, you need investment in the creation of that movie. When you have a multi-sided movie that is being created in multiple jurisdictions, you need investment into the creation of that movie to make it world class. You need lots of different resources. Sometimes a whole movie village is created just to shoot a particular movie. And for you to do that, to have the type of quality, high quality that you would want for posterity, you would need to have investment and you would need a return of investment. And that's one of the theoretical foundations of intellectual property. So one could say a Lockean theory, right, to say you have reward for the labor or reward for the investment. And another theory would be an incentive. So it could also be an incentive for you to create. So that's the role of copyright. And many times when you have a jurisdiction, for example, that has an effective copyright system, that would inspire you to invest in creating this type of movies. I would say, obviously, to point out that sometimes we have jurisdictions like Nigeria, for example, that has thrived, that had a thriving movie industry, the Nollywood industry outside a firm copyright system, like Professor Fumi Arewa and Professor Chidi Ogwamanam and others have written about. However, we see that now that Nollywood is also trying to move to bigger stages, we are seeing more of a central role of copyright and intellectual property taking place now. So while intellectual property might not have foundations or roots in Africa, one of my theses in this project is to argue that actually Africa can reposition, or Africa can utilize the frame of intellectual property in ways that would be beneficial to its own social and economic development. So how we create or recreate our intellectual property architecture and how we implement it can have a direct role in these conversations around the Agenda 2063. So what is the Agenda 2063? What is the foundation for this Pan-African Renaissance? So we are saying we want a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. We want an integrated continent, a politically united continent based on the ideals of Pan-Africanism and the vision of Africa's Renaissance. We want an Africa of good governance, democracy, respect for human rights, justice, the rule of law. We want a peaceful and secure Africa. Actually, all of these would not, all of the innovation and creativity that we're discussing cannot happen outside having a peaceful and secure continent. We want an Africa with a strong cultural identity, heritage, values, ethics. We want an Africa whose development is people-driven, relying on the potential of African people, especially its youth, its women. We want also an Africa that is strong, united, resilient, and an influential global player and partner. So some of the flagship projects of the African AU's Agenda 2063 include having a virtual and e-university, establishing an annual African Economic Forum, having free movement of people, and of course, one of the biggest would be the African Continental Free Trade Area. And I would say that actually all of these projects would work hand in hand, right? So if we are going to have a successful African Continental Free Trade Area or regional integration, we would need to have enhanced movement of people. When I was coming to South Africa, I had a long list of requirements, documents I had to submit at the High Commission, and they would not even collect my application if I did not have, for example, they wanted to have a verified copy of the workshop host personal ID. And that was surprising. So apart from providing their certificate of incorporation, they also wanted to have that. And I gave them evidence of my permanent employment. I'm Nigerian, I'm African, but that could not suffice. So I think that if we have free movement, it will also enhance the type of interactions that we can have on the continent. So I would say that all of these flagship projects would work collectively to help to achieve the AfCFTA vision. So the African Continental Free Trade Area, I'm sure that we're all, many of us are familiar with what the African Continental Free Trade is. We want to promote intra-African trade. We want to promote economic integration on the continent. And this year has been the African Union's year of the AfCFTA, so accelerating the implementation of the AfCFTA. I thought to share some key facts about the AfCFTA. So the next slide, we know that it covers about 55 African Union countries, 8 regional economic communities. It has a number of protocols, including the Protocol on Intellectual Property, Trade in Goods and Services, Investment, Competition, Policy, Digital Trade, and Women, Youth, and those are integral. So the next slide, please. Those are integral parts of the AfCFTA. It connects about 1.3 billion people across the African continent with a combined GDP valued at about $3.4 trillion. It seeks to foster industrialization, investment, job creation, enhancing the competitiveness of Africa in the medium to long term. And I think that the success of the AfCFTA will depend also on the success of other flagship programs of the AfCFTA. Trading officially commenced on the 1st of January 2021. So what is the role of intellectual property in this conversation? I think historically, intellectual property lawmaking in Africa has been mostly driven by external or Western influences. Professor Nkube's book has been instrumental in sort of showcasing the history of intellectual property rights in Africa. I think that she has a new version that would be coming out soon. We know that externally driven lawmaking trajectory in Africa has led to this fragmented Western-centric intellectual property architecture on the continent. So, for example, we have two main intellectual property organizations, the African Regional Intellectual Property Organization, ARIPO, that covers mostly English-speaking countries, and we have the OAPI, African Intellectual Property Organization, that covers mostly Francophone African countries. Now, the OAPI, for example, is mainly driven by its influence with France, right, which was its former colonial authority. So you see that many of the laws in Francophone Africa, OAPI, will be driven from the French legacy, right? And OAPI adopts a uniform system. So that means that once you're a member of OAPI, OAPI laws directly are applicable in the member states, the 17 member states of OAPI, and also judicial decisions enforcement would be applicable across board. So OAPI sort of operates its own system as one block, and then you have a separate flexible system operating under ARIPO, where you have different instruments or you have different protocols, and you can pick and choose. So you can choose which instrument you want to sign up to. But we see that also ARIPO's lawmaking has been influenced by its own external relationships as well. We see WIPO playing a strong role in the development of ARIPO and OAPI. In fact, many times when you see a meeting inviting both OAPI and ARIPO, you see that is organized by WIPO. And sometimes I wonder, how would you come from Geneva to bring two brothers or two sisters, right, from Senegal and Zimbabwe together on the continent, and you have to come all the way from Geneva to do that. So we have this fragmented structure, OAPI, ARIPO, but beyond that, we also then have some countries that are non-members of either OAPI or ARIPO. For example, you have Nigeria, right? You have Egypt. You have some of the economic powers on the continent that are non-members for different reasons, for political reasons, for economic reasons, sometimes even for status, right? You don't want to be under the influence of an organization to direct, your intellectual property laws. So you have these systems operating in silos. But beyond that, you also now have regional economic communities that have provisions that are related to intellectual property. You have SADC, you have EAC, East African Community, you have, ECOWAS, that you have different of these organizations that have some provisions or policies or statements that are related to intellectual property rights. So you have this, overlapping intellectual property systems without one, common position on intellectual property. However, outside this fragmentation we have on the continent, we also then have, for example, the African group at the WTO, at the TRIPS Council, that's the World Trade Organization, the TRIPS Council, or you have it at the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO. So when you're having negotiations at those levels, the African group somewhat comes together. But one question would be, what informs the common position, right? We already are operating in silos in different regimes or frames on the continent. So what informs the common or shared position that we have at that level? And is there an interaction? Who decides what the African Union's position is at the international level? And how do we communicate that back to the regional economic communities and to the national levels? And I think this has been one of the tensions that we have had at the international level and at the national levels. So, for example, now that we're having conversations around the African Continental Free Trade Area, the question is, what is an African-centered intellectual property right? What position? Is it what OAPI does? Is it what ARIPO does? Is it what we have said at the African group level at WIPO TRIPS, or the African group at WTO, at the WIPO or WTO? Or is it even what we have agreed in our bilateral agreements of free trade area agreements? Because we also have that as an influence in our lawmaking. So sometimes beyond what we have decided at the regional levels, you can have a bilateral agreement with the country. For example, let's say Tanzania having an economic partnership agreement requiring it to introduce a certain type of law. For example, the use of the International Convention for the Protection of New Varieties of Plants. So beyond what happens at the national level, you can have a bilateral agreement that influences you or mandates you to introduce a certain type of intellectual property right. So one question here is, what is the African position? If we say we're going to have an African-centered position on intellectual property, who decides that? As a core AfCFTA protocol, the protocol on intellectual property now offers a pivotal opportunity for Africa to reformulate or formulate, if we've never had, its intellectual property approach or strategy. And I think that that is where we are now. So if we are going to take the AU's Agenda 2063 seriously, to say we want a Pan-African Renaissance, then we have to strategically think, what does that mean in the different pockets of economic areas that will have an influence on growth? So, for example, for intellectual property, what would that mean? Taking cognizance of Western influences that have informed the formulation of intellectual property orthodoxies. How can Africa restructure its approach to intellectual property and rights with the aim to leverage it as a driving force for endogenous, internally-driven development? I think this is at the center of this conversation. Now, I don't have a firm answer, and I hope that we can finish the so that Professor Kibe can also share and Ambassador can also share what their thoughts would be on this. However, if we go to the next slide, I say that there are certain sectors that are low-hanging fruits for Africa that we can begin to tap the potentials that we have. Agriculture. Africa is a huge continent with beautiful landscape for agriculture, for growing, different varieties of plants, right? In a sustainable way, in an agroecological way that would not just feed the continent, but that we would have crops for export. And I think that we could also use our comparative advantages in the different communities and countries. So what grows best in South Africa or in this particular region? What grows best in Kenya? What grows best in Malawi? Which are the countries that are weaker? How can we work together as an economic bloc to support one another? I think agriculture here would be one of our main strengths. However, what is happening is that there is a gradual erosion and extinction of our own local varieties. And now we're seeing, improved varieties, genetically modified varieties. Even some of our local meals are gradually going into extinction. And now I'm going to the shelf in the supermarket and I want to purchase something. I only see cornflakes, I see Kellogg's, and I'm asking, where is my local millet? Where is my local meal that I grew up drinking? And I want to feed my nephews, and they tell me they don't want to take pap because it's Nigeria. They want to have cornflakes because it's convenient, right? So I'm not even going to go into the nutritional impacts of the meals, but I'm talking about the availability of crops. Because it's not just having the food on the table, it's also thinking about the production. If the food is gradually going away from the table, that means that the seeds and the plant varieties are also gradually going into extinction, and the local farmers would have to depend on the imported varieties to meet the consumers' needs. Now, what informs these consumers' needs? I think there's also the place of advertisements, there's also the place of, I don't know if I should call it sort of not subjugating, but tending to marginalize the types of food that are African, right? But they sometimes don't look cool. But I think I've now gotten to that because I used to laugh at my parents when we travel, and when they go to a new country, they would want to eat Nigerian food. And I used to want that like when you're in Rome, you're Roman, right? You eat pasta, eat pizza, eat something. So then when I traveled, I would want to eat what is local. But now I think I've gotten to the stage that when I go to a new country, now I'm asking, where's the Nigerian restaurant? So I realized that I shouldn't laugh at my parents too early because I just might become them, right? Because I realized that those meals are actually healthy. So if I'm going to eat, like in Nigeria, we call it, like a vegetable stew, it's really just vegetables that is warmed and you're eating healthy. So I don't just want to, eat empty calories. Anyway, so that's a conversation about agriculture. Public health, I think that we could also mix both the mainstream type of pharmaceuticals with our own traditional medicines. And I think that having both working side by side will help to build effective public health systems on the continent. So when COVID broke out, when we did not, we were still trying to figure out what was happening. I know that in many parts of Nigeria, people started coming up with options of things that they could take to boost their immunity, So we had we call something bitter cola and people took it. We, just make some leaves, we call it agbo. I don't know if there's any Nigerian here, So there's a mix of herbs and roots that we take, and you could see the effect. Now, one of the limitations of that is that we have not properly documented what those combinations contain. Now, those combinations, because even our mainstream our mainstream drugs are extracts from roots and herbs, but we've been able to identify what they are. We've been able to identify the proportion that is required for one tablet. We've been able to identify when you need to take it. Now, one of the limitations with our types of traditional medicines in certain instances is that we only say drink 1 cup, but we can't really explain why you should drink 1 cup of that. We can't really explain, what the components or what the combination of those roots are. And I think, as we would see in subsequent slides, that might be one of the things that we can do to promote our own type of traditional medicines. Now, another industry that I'm excited about is our creative industries, right? So South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, we have thriving music industries, we have thriving fashion industries, and I think that those are low-hanging fruits that we can harness in building the type of social and economic development that we want on the continent. Against all odds, we've seen our Afrobeats being transported and circulated to the world. Now you go to any country in the world and you hear Afrobeats playing, side by side the US songs. Now I don't even know what the latest US songs are because really I'm listening to Afrobeats at the World Cup. You see Afrobeats being played. At the King's coronation, we saw Tiwa Savage, Queen of Afrobeats, performing her song there. So you see how the music industry has sort of circulated globally. And then we also have new emerging technologies. We have Yabakon Valley in Nigeria. We have Kenya's Silicon Savannah. We have all of these tech hubs that are budding across the continent, coming up with innovative products that are now being copied or learned, or borrowed in other jurisdictions to understand, what this type of payment. So our mobile payment system was a world-leading trend, right, that people had to learn from, and even other global south countries had to build on. So I think that we have, some low-hanging fruits that without having extensive investment, we can begin to harness. And next, I'll go to one of the examples that is, one of my new favorites, right? It's called Pedro's Premium Ogogoro. So it's a type of alcoholic drink that has been, and I should check what the name of it would be in South Africa, but I know that different African countries had different names for their own brand of it. So it's a type of alcoholic drink, but it was banned, right, in colonial times. It was banned for certain reasons. So they were talking about the efficacy, whether it was healthy or not. They were talking about questions around the alcohol levels. Anyways, there was a whole agenda. But one of the reasons for this was also to increase the import of the schnapps, for example. So I didn't even know that that was not indigenous. And now we started using it for all of our traditional events. We have these young people, Lola and Chibu, that have designed Pedro's Premium Ogogoro, and their product is the epitome of the resilience of the African youth, because every detail in the production of this Premium Ogogoro has taken Africa at the core of their product. So they explain that if you see the shape of a Pedro's bottle, it is the shape of the drum used to distill Ogogoro in the bush. We wanted to salute and pay homage to the traditional techniques, but tweak it in a way that is contemporary. There is a lot of thinking in the packaging. We wrap our bottles in brown paper. When you think of any premium spirits, they have boxes. We were told that if you want to produce a luxury drink, you have to put it in a box. We are Nigerians. We tie wrappers, especially in the South, both women and men tie wrappers. So we decided to wrap our bottles. If you look at the yarn that is securing the wrapped paper, it is raffia because our palm wine comes from the raffia palm tree. The fiber from the palm tree is how we are tying everything together. When we open our bottles, we pour a libation. You have rituals when you're drinking fine wine. You swirl it around. We also have ours. We pour to the ancestors first, and then we drink. The first person that does the libation is the eldest person in the room. Everywhere we have tastings, we always pour a libation. That usually arrests people. This is the part of the branding that comes from our truth and our heritage. We are consistently trying to reconnect the essence of our culture and heritage and to bring it to the 21st century, to give it a contemporary sexiness that can be relevant to people now. So these are young people that have created this premium Ogogoro bottle without government support, I must say. And now we contrast that to Scotch whiskey. So next slide. We have Scotch whiskey that is shipped from Scotland, where I live, to around 180 markets around the world every second. In 2002, Scotch whiskey exports were worth 6.2 billion. When Theresa May came to South Africa for her visit, she came with the head of the Scotch Whisky Association in trying to promote Scotch whisky in South Africa. And you'll see in the next slide what the result has been. Scotch whisky, no, we're still on the previous slide. So Scotch whisky industry provides 5.5 billion pounds in gross value added to the UK economy. It creates over 11,000 jobs. 7,000 of these jobs are in rural areas. In 2019, there were 2.2 million visits to Scotch whisky distilleries, making the industry the third most popular tourist attraction in Scotland. There are currently about 145 operating distilleries in Scotland, right? Now, you see that South Africa is one of the largest export destinations for Scotch whisky. According to the Minister of State Department for Business and Trade, Scotch whisky is one of UK's great exporting success stories, contributing billions of pounds to the economy and supporting thousands of jobs. So I'm pleased to see these export figures showing a growing global demand. It's essential we continue to support the industry as it expands into new markets, thanks to our new trade agreements around the world. As we set sight on 1 trillion exports by 2030, I'm confident we can see Scotch whisky go from strength to strength in the years ahead. When I had the interview with Pedro's Ogogoro, first of all, they did not have any government support in building their brand. They've been trying to export their Ogogoro, but they have faced multiple restrictions in different countries, right? First of all, across Africa, and then in the UK, in the US, they have faced these layers of restrictions and limitations. So, and they have done all of this outside government support. Now we're having a conversation about intellectual property, and we're thinking about the potential of having Ogogoro protected as a type of geographical indication. So perhaps we could organize a group of Ogogoro producers, think about standardization, think about having an association, and think about how to build that brand. One of the things that I found that was a distinguishing factor of Pedro's Ogogoro was the branding. So it is the branding that has differentiated it from the other products that were banned in the past. And so I say this to say that actually Africa's entrepreneurs have been actively engaged in building products outside the firm support of government. So if we are really thinking about Agenda 2063, we should think about how to support these entrepreneurs who would be the one to drive the type of social and economic development, job creation that can contribute to the growth that we want. Scotch Whisky Association, we see the role of the government, the Scottish government and the UK government in supporting the building of that industry. So I just wanted to put those side by side. Now, what are some tools for transformation that we can have? So in addition to the Agenda 2063 flagship projects, I think education is important. So Pedro's was able to show us that they understood colonial continuities. They understood why you should not just take luxury to mean placing a product in a box. Actually, you can use the type of products, the materials that you have on the continent to build your brand. And that was exactly what they did. And I'm pleased that I've invited them to a conference that we're organizing in about 2 weeks in Accra on African International Economic Law. And they're going to tell us more about their thinking behind the creation of the brand. So I think education is at the center of explaining what it really means, to be African, what it means to produce African products, and how we can distinctively set products out that would not just be replicas because you want to look cool, but products that would be able to promote the type of growth that we want. Training and capacity building across board. So for entrepreneurs, for government officials, I think that we need training. Research and development, it goes without saying. I think that once we're able to conduct research across the different sectors that we're working on, we can begin to think of how to enhance this African story. Data and documentation, one of the limitations that we've had is limited data. So we don't, for example, when we're doing the research on Ogogoro, we didn't have firm documentation on exact days when things were banned. For example, when bans were lifted, what the backstory was, because we don't have a lot of written evidence around it. And many of our type of knowledge is transferred orally, right? So we transfer it intergenerationally through word of mouth, through songs. So I think that we need to do more documentation to sort of build the type of knowledge base that we want. I think we should have South-South cooperation. So let's look at what other global South countries are doing, and let's exchange knowledge. But importantly, I think we need internally generated financing. So it is sad that the African Union, even in promoting its Agenda 2063, we don't have sort of a robust financing from the African Union in building this whole agenda. We're only 4 decades to Agenda 2063. And if we're going to have the type of revolutionary change that we anticipate, we need to have internally financed funding across the different sectors of the continent to build the type of change that we want. So at the end, I think that we're reminded that Africa must wake up to the reality that its destiny lies in its own hands. African entrepreneurs have exhibited remarkable resilience and creativity, showcasing their ability to thrive despite limited support. It is now crucial for governments to support these young dynamic entrepreneurs through effective laws, policies, and supportive ecosystems for entrepreneurship. And in particular, the construction of African-centered intellectual property rights holds significant potential to contribute to Africa's revolutionary stories and journeys. So I put examples of different African-driven small, medium-scale businesses that are beginning to change the face of Africa. And on this note, I thank you all for listening, and I look forward to what's having.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. That's been a fantastic overview of Africa's development pathway and how intellectual property rights can support it. And I love the story of the young boy from Malawi as a starting point in the discussion. Too often we start from high up, rules on global governance, but we forget that what it is all about. It's really about that young man on the ground and how we can empower that young person to develop our countries and our continent. So you really have, I think, explained very well the relationship between intellectual property rights, global laws or disciplines, rules, and how that either advances or undermines the development of the continent. So a really nice trajectory. I think that a nice overview. There's a lot of things it reminded me of as you were talking about different issues we've been dealing with on the continent, on dealing with intellectual property rights and struggles we have fought with the United States, with the European Union on these issues. And I'm sure many of you have many questions and comments you want to make. And And please feel free to do so. And Pedro is there, who is our lead researcher on food and food systems, and the complexity of the food systems on the continent and the different trends that impact on it, and how intellectual property plays a role in developing these systems so that they advance the objectives we have on the continent for food, nutrition, health, and economic development. So anybody wants to come in and say a few words or comments or just ask a question of Titilayo, please go ahead.
I do have a question. Hi, I'm Marisa, just to introduce myself. I'm actually from Malawi. So you spoke about the conflict in terms of the existing regimes, be it we have Repo, you mentioned the other one, I'm not familiar with. Yes, and then the regional economic communities as well, and just the conflict in terms of the laws that are existing in those different systems and which one do you follow? I know you say we don't necessarily have the solution for it, but what would you recommend in that kind of situation? Like, what should we be working towards as a continent? Should we be working towards a continental framework that all member states are following? And yeah, basically that's my question.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that's a brilliant question, and I think that's the question of the moment, right? I think that when we are formulating the laws for Africa, for the protocol, we should be guided by the underlying philosophies, by the rationale for those laws. So that's the first point. So what is the AfCFTA? What is Agenda 2063? That should be our foundation in thinking about the law. So if we are thinking about an Africa that is African-centered, that is prosperous, that is driven by its own terms, driven by its own people, that has endogenous development, that is protecting the interests of its own people, right? That means intellectual property rights should also be supportive of the development of its own people. That should be the foundation, right? So I think that the AfCFTA IP protocol ideally should start from the position of Pan-Africanism to say, what does IP mean for Africa? What are the best type of intellectual property frameworks for Africa? And then we should look at the existing, so let's look at the existing fragmentation that we have and take each of the subject matters and say, how are we going to create a common, right? It doesn't have to be exactly the same. So common, how do we interpret common? Are we going to have, for example, some type of minimum standards, but then they could be contoured or tailored to suit domestic reality, specific domestic reality. So let's say Malawi has certain needs that are different from South Africa, for example, then Malawi can make, but we should have that basic foundation that would be the same. So for example, let's say that we're thinking about plant variety protection as a form of intellectual property. Maybe a foundation or a base would be that all countries must have farmers' rights in their plant variety protection law. So that means we must always make sure that we are protecting the interests of small-scale farmers. We must always have access and benefit sharing frameworks. Those are to help ensure that we're limiting biopiracy or the unauthorized use of our varieties. And then we should have that alongside plant breeders' rights systems, right? So that would be the foundation. Now, how Malawi would want to interpret that could be different. Do we want to have that in a seed law? Do you want to have that as a comprehensive law? But we should come with that foundation. That would be my position. And for all the types of intellectual property systems, so the same will go for patent. Are we going to have certain exceptions to help ensure that in cases of emergencies, pandemics, epidemics, that we have access to these essential medicines? First of all, are we going to build our local manufacturing capacity to make sure that we can produce, make sure that intellectual property rights would not limit the production? Those would be the basic foundation. So I think that we should have common set of rules that are centered on this foundation. The foundation must always carry us, that what we're doing is to ensure that we are promoting the prosperity, socio-economic development of Africa. So not just having intellectual property rights systems that would be beneficial to foreign investors or foreign inventors and creators. So to ensure that the type of intellectual property rights that we have, actually our own local manufacturers would be able to benefit from the IP architecture. So having those common rules. But the core of it would be having or remembering what the what Pan-Africanism means. And I think that is what is missing. I think that's actually what is missing in the negotiations, because people are still coming as countries. So you're coming to the negotiation as this is what South Africa wants, or this is what Malawi wants, this is what Egypt wants. That's not what our center should be. This is what Africa wants. And Africa is only going to be as strong as the weakest country. It's only going to be as strong as the least LDC. And I think that what we should be thinking about is how to even close the gap. We don't want to have any LDCs anymore. We want a prosperous Africa that the weakest country is as strong to be able to stand alone, to have the type of socio-economic development that we want. So that was my position.
Great, thank you.
I'm total novice in this area, but I'm just interested about who funds work around intellectual property in Africa. Who's funding the coordinations of those bodies or of the work that's done in the area? Because I don't know if this is right, but I don't know if how easily able intellectual property law is able to recognize work that hasn't been officially researched or captured or recorded and written somewhere. And it seems like we were mentioning there's a lot of work to do about writing up our knowledge so that it can be claimed. And I'm sure it's in the interest of other companies and multinationals to say, okay, what is it, that herb that's used for slimming? That's great for our diet pill. So let's run a research thing and then we can patent this active ingredient. So is there work it doesn't have to be publicly funded, but that is coming from the continent to put in the base for intellectual property? And I just would like to hear your thoughts on that, because I'm totally new to the area.
So when you say, thank you, I think that's an excellent question. When you say base for intellectual property, I'm not quite sure.
Well, I don't know if it's a correct assumption, but I assume that unless I've got evidence somewhere that's recognized that this was an idea that belongs to this community, or unless there's evidence for that, you can't make a claim for property rights over that. So if a lot of our knowledge is recorded in a story or in not in a peer-reviewed journal, then sort of up for grabs, so to speak, by some other researcher or someone else who comes in and publishes and discovers.
So I think that okay, that's a great question. I think that that's then the role of national competent authorities to ensure that before certain types of knowledge or certain types of innovation would be extracted from the continent or from a particular country, that you would have authorization to do so, right? So in the example of your herbs, of the herbs that you're mentioning, there should be authorization. So even if it has not been protected, if it is public knowledge, that would defeat the requirement for novelty in the first place. So the requirements for patentability are novelty, industrial application, it should not be excluded, subject matter. So if novelty is already lost, then you should not be able to protect. That's the case that we had in India, for example, with things like neem and turmeric, right? When some companies were trying to protect it in the US. So you cannot protect it because it's not novel. It's already in public domain. So somebody doesn't even need to have documented it, but it's in public domain. So it is common knowledge that in this area, you use this particular herb for slimming. So that means it defeats the requirements of patentability or protection in the first place. So it will be about safeguarding the requirements for the different intellectual property rights to ensure that to ensure that countries are not circumnavigating those requirements in a way that they're still able to protect, these inventions, even though they don't meet the requirements for the type of intellectual property rights. So it's the same thing, novelty for patents, it will be the same thing for plant variety protection, for example, or even geographical indications. So if it's certain in Mozambique now, we have technical, or even in South Africa, we have Rooibos.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're not part of that community or part of those producers, you cannot come and protect Rooibos. Right. So it is to ensure that the intellectual property office would have a responsibility to ensure that, people that do not meet the requirements of the type of intellectual property rights do not have protection. So it depends on which type of intellectual property rights it will be.
Thank you.
No, thank you for your talk. I think it was very insightful. I think my core concern, or something I've just been struggling with, is, already within African countries or states, there is movement, against the existing laws to see, like they aren't really fitting the constitution or the national development plan, or etc. So there's already a movement for that, and that's quite a stagnant, sort of slow process. How are we going to ensure? I know this may not answer you have, but how does one then accelerate the need to actually have the AfCFTA, and then to also, I don't know from your experience, how much enthusiasm is there to already, develop something at that level? Because part of the issues that you've mentioned, like access to medicines, traditional knowledge, protecting plant varieties, all of those things, they are existing, legislation in certain countries. So I'm just sort of thinking about what is your experience been.
That's a brilliant question. Thank you. My dream would be for us to have some type of some type of film that really captures the essence of Pan-Africanism, that really captures the essence of the AU Agenda 2063, a movie that the whole continent can watch. So that means it should be translated into the languages. It should be accessible. That means people should understand what the vision is. I think this reminds me of the whole, movement in the 1950s, this movement of decolonization, this movement of independence, that if this wave can sweep around the continent, then we actually realize that what we are pushing for is a unity that would be beneficial, not just for us. Actually, we are not going to reap the greatest benefit of this. It will be for our children and grandchildren. But how do we capture that essence? So, for example, in India, when there were the conversations around farmers' rights and plant varieties, they were able to translate it in languages that the farmers on the street understood and said, our seeds are not for sale. Even if that was the only thing they understood, they had that national spirit. They knew what it meant, and they were able to stand on the streets of Delhi. They were able to protest in Geneva at the WTO to say we're not selling our seeds. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that in Africa. I'm not saying us all owning this AfCFTA. And that's what we need to own. I think that's what we need to own, that story, to say that this is a continent of the same people. We might be from different, we might have been drawn in colonial lines around different, put in different subgroups and, called countries, and some of the names of the countries were even given to us. But we can all come together to say, you know what, now we are ready to push for economic development. And what do we need to do? What do we need to do? And it's not just for Africa, friends of Africa as well. What do we all need to do, right? So I'm in Europe, and I conduct research for, that would be beneficial, because I understand that spirit for what is happening, in that time. So the same thing here. What is the African spirit? I don't think we have an answer to that. Because when we are negotiating, we are also negotiating as independent countries, as Nigeria or Algeria. We don't have that spirit, hasn't engulfed the continent. So I think we need media, soft media, social media, mainstream media, we need media to circulate, to say the spirit of Africa. What is that spirit?
Yeah.
I don't know what that spirit, because this is about economic prosperity. And each one, there's a proverb that says that one hand cannot wash a face, right? You need everything to wash together. So we all need to collaborate, and that is the concerted effort and the strategic actions I think need to be put in place. So my short answer would be, we should use media, mainstream media and social media, contemporary media, to blow up what the picture of Pan-African Renaissance means to everybody, not just lawmakers, so that the person in the village can sing the story of being African and being proud of being African, so that the crop that they are growing, they are proud of that crop, and they are growing it and sharing it, and people are eating it, and we remember what it means to be African. That's my vision, that's my dream for African. I think that would be
something interesting. I think maybe it's the language then to say you're decolonizing intellectual property.
I think my language is to say that I'm presenting an African-centered position on intellectual property.
Okay.
So we don't have to always prioritize the decolonization. Let us start from Africa. So we don't have to compare it to something else, right? Compare Africa to Africa. I want to present an African-centered position on intellectual property rights.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, that's a great way to bring this to a conclusion. I think that Titilayo, you're really leading the way on the vision for a new African intellectual property rights regime. As you said, the starting point has to be what's good for the African continent, inspired by the dream of Pan-Africanism, thinking about the continent as a space that brings all of us together, other than a federation of different countries. How can people working together build a vision for the continent? So your intellectual property rights regime is located there. So that's a really amazing, I think, vision to inspire the negotiators in the negotiations on the AfCFTA intellectual property rights protocol that we're negotiating. Yes. There's someone there. After from Ethiopia.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome, Doctor, to our school, our humble school, the young school, going in line with what you presented today, going in line with the Africa we want, that is the Agenda 2063. And your presentation was so nice, actually, informative, and I enjoyed on the one hand, and also just trying to ask myself where we are exactly in terms of going through to the 2063. So my question is a little bit general. Perhaps even Faisal will help us out. My question is, where is Africa in terms of this Africa continental free trade area? Is it really taking shape? Because, we were waiting all the way to the 2030 sustainable development goal, and we know now that we're not going to achieve it. And even the 2063 is tomorrow. There is no doubt that 2063 will come, and it's tomorrow. So where are we? Is it really taking shape in terms of this free trade area? One. And second, even if you see, for example, the Pan-Africanism, the Africa passport, and free movement of people, I sometimes bring this issue into South Africa, into the home affairs. Where are we? Are we really in line with this? Are we really in line with all these policies? Yesterday, I was discussing with Carlos Lopez about how we come through from the Millennium Development Goal, then to Sustainable Development Goal, then to Africa, to the African Agenda 2063. And he explained us incredible ideas which we don't know how the politics behind the scene, the politics behind the sustainable development goals, the politics behind the Millennium Development Goals. But at least we assume that the Agenda 2063 is our agenda, our policy. We are much way forward beyond what the other world thinks. But in terms of practice, are we not like really ambitious in terms of setting deadlines to these lofty goals and rather later on struggling with achieving them? So it's a little bit general, but Dr. Titi, you can take it to your presentation. Where are we in terms of this intellectual property rights? Taking this, don't forget also the brain drain. The brain drain. You are somewhere and you are an intellectual, but they owned you. So whatever you produce there is owned by the school you are working for. So all these things, yeah, it's a little bit general, but yeah, thank you.
Okay, after you've been provocative, huh? You're provoking. Okay, that's Hafta is a postdoc student at the school, and we're very happy to have him here. He's discussing governance issues on the continent, so he's thinking about that all the time. You want to say something at this point?
I thought you
But maybe I'll ask Yakubu. Yakubu has just finished writing a fantastic piece on the AfCFTA. Yakubu, introduce yourself. You come all the way from Nigeria.
Yes, I'm Yakubu Nagu. Well, on where the question is on what what's the position of the
where the AfCFTA is
now
and clear.
Yeah, I know that a few months ago, the Assembly of Heads of States and Governments agreed on the basic protocols, that's like investments and competition. But I'm not sure if the annexes to those protocols or the IP protocol is available yet to the public. Yeah, so.
Yeah. So I think Hafta's asking a much more general question about the progress that is being made.
Political will.
Yeah, and the political will. There's no doubt, that certainly in my experience over the last 30 years working on trade, this agreement has got the greatest political force behind it than any other we've ever seen. And I followed very closely the discussions on NetHeart, for example, which really had a lot of excitement on the continent, but didn't have the political support of all the member states. It was just a small group of countries that were driving it. This time, there is enormous political support because the continent really is looking for a pathway to develop its capabilities and really reach that vision of Agenda 2063. And this is a crucial pathway, one of the most exciting pathways. It's a dynamic pathway. You see the AfCFTA started with a relatively narrow agenda. Its agenda was trade integration. It's already expanded to industrial development. That's partly, the discussions we have had with people like Carlos Lopez, Kendall Kubey, Adeyemi Piolu from Nigeria, and others who participated, in the discourse of how to advance the implementation of the AfCFTA in a manner which was more developmental, more inclusive. And so the discourse expanded beyond. And then more recently, you've seen the siphoned by the private sector, who have really seen this as an opportunity to advance their own business interests across the African continent. And we did see a month ago here in Cape Town, there was a AfCFTA business forum, and most of us participated in that. There were 2,000 delegates and a number of Fortune 500 companies. Of course, the idea of thinking about their own interests, but the challenge for us, for the AfCFTA, is to really use that energy and the investment that we need to do what we need to do on the African continent, to solve the problems of that young man in Malawi. And that's how we always have to think, how to mobilize the resources by building this vision, which is attractive, which sees Africa as a destination for investment. And part of the process has really been bringing together some of Africa's best minds and intellectuals to recreate the dream that you talked about, Titi. There is a recreation of that dream in the current reality of a fast-changing world. The geopolitics of the world is changing rapidly because, you know, developing countries are emerging and they want their place at the table of global discourse, dialogue, and decision-making and governance. So this is changing the trajectory. Carlos has just been busy in the last 2 months talking about the need to change the financial architecture of the world. First time ever since the Bretton Woods were created in 1944, we now have a debate about changing the architecture of the financial system. It's just begun, but it has been spurred by this need to think about a bigger world, not just a world that is driven by the few countries in the world, a few big countries. So it really, the question then after is ours, you know, it's what are we able to do? And how are we able to galvanize the intellectual resources of our continent, those who are here, but those who are, you know, in the diaspora all over the world, how we mobilize them and those resources to advance our strategies and pathways towards achieving the objectives of Agenda 2063. And so I can see a huge process that is unfolding. And our task is really to contribute to the building of this next generation of leaders. And we can see that happening as, you know, this new African identity, not just Nigerian or Malawian or South African, but an African identity that begins to emerge. A bit like how the Europeans were able to overcome more than 1,000 years of conflict after 1945 to create the European Economic Community and a European identity that has definitely emerged, the European identity. And you would have thought it was impossible in 1945 because they had 1,000 years of conflict behind them. They couldn't possibly think about how they can live together as one people. So that is our challenge, and we are on our way. Thank you very much. Thanks to Titi and for coming to our school. I'm sure people want to say hello to you and exchange maybe cards. And we have a few PhD students just finishing and on their way to graduating as well. So very pleased that we have been all inspired by your work, and we look forward to seeing you here more often at the Nelson Mandela School and collaborating with all of us in your projects we already know. Thank you so much for coming to the school.